This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 9. I'll tell thee, Berthold, what men's hopes are like. A silly child that, quivering with joy, would cast its little mimic fishing line, baited with lodestone for a bowl of toys, in the salt ocean. 8 months after the arrival of the family at Offendene, that is to say in the end of the following June, a rumor was spread in the neighborhood which to many persons was matter of exciting interest. It had no reference to the results of the American War, but it was one which touched all classes within a certain circuit around Wanchester. The corn factors, the brewers, the horse dealers, and saddlers, all held it a laudable thing, and one which was to be rejoiced in on abstract grounds as showing the value of an aristocracy in a free country like England. The blacksmith in the hamlet of Diplow felt that a good time had come round. The wives of laboring men hoped their nimble boys of 10 or 12 would be taken into employ by the gentlemen in livery; and the farmers about Diplow admitted with a tincture of bitterness and reserve that a man might now again perhaps have an easier market or exchange for a rick of old hay or a wagon-load of straw. If such were the hopes of low persons not in society, it may be easily inferred that their betters had better reasons for satisfaction, probably connected with the pleasures of life rather than its business. Marriage, however, must be considered as coming under both heads, and just as when a visit of majesty is announced, the dream of knighthood or a baronetcy is to be found under various municipal nightcaps, so the news in question raised a floating indeterminate vision of marriage in several well-bred imaginations. The news was that Diplow Hall, Sir Hugo Mallinger's place, which had for a couple of years turned its white window-shutters in a painfully wall-eyed manner on its fine elms and beeches, its lilied pool and grassy acres specked with deer, was being prepared for a tenant, and was for the rest of the summer and through the hunting season to be inhabited in a fitting style both as to house and stable. But not by Sir Hugo himself, by his nephew, Mr. Mallinger Grandcourt, who was presumptive heir to the baronetcy, his uncle's marriage having produced nothing but girls. Nor was this the only contingency with which fortune flattered young Grandcourt, as he was pleasantly called, for while the chance of the baronetcy came through his father, his mother had given a baronial streak to his blood, so that if certain intervening persons slightly painted in the middle distance died, he would become a baron and peer of this realm. It is the uneven allotment of nature that the male bird alone has the tuft, but we have not yet followed the advice of hasty philosophers who would have us copy nature entirely in these matters. And if Mr. Mallinger Grandcourt became a baronet or a peer, his wife would share the title, which in addition to his actual fortune was certainly a reason why that wife, being at present unchosen, should be thought of by more than one person with a sympathetic interest as a woman sure to be well provided for. Some readers of this history will doubtless regard it as incredible that people should construct matrimonial prospects on the mere report that a bachelor of good fortune and possibilities was coming within reach, and will reject the statement as a mere outflow of gall. They will aver that neither they nor their first cousins have minds so unbridled, and that in fact this is not human nature, which would know that such speculations might turn out to be fallacious, and would therefore not entertain them. But let it be observed, nothing is here narrated of human nature generally. The history in its present stage concerns only a few people in a corner of Wessex, whose reputation, however, was unimpeached, and who, I am in the proud position of being able to state, were all on visiting terms with persons of rank. There were the Arrowpoints, for example, in their beautiful place at Quetcham. No one could attribute sordid views in relation to their daughter's marriage to parents who could leave her at least $500,000, but having affectionate anxieties about their Catherine's position, she having resolutely refused Lord Slogan, an unexceptionable Irish peer whose estate wanted nothing but drainage and population, they wondered, perhaps from something more than a charitable impulse, whether Mr. Grandcourt was good-looking, of sound constitution, virtuous, or at least reformed, and if liberal conservative was not too liberal conservative, and without wishing anybody to die, thought his succession to the title an event to be desired. If the Arrowpoints had such ruminations, it is the less surprising that they were stimulated in Mr. Gascoigne, who for being a clergyman was not the less subject to the anxieties of a parent and guardian, and we have seen how both he and Mrs. Gascoigne might by this time have come to feel that he was overcharged with the management of young creatures, who were hardly to be held in with bit or bridle, or any sort of metaphor that would stand for judicious advice. Naturally, people did not tell each other all they felt and thought about young Grandcourt's advent. On no subject was this openness found prudently practicable, not even on the generation of acids or the destination of the fixed stars. For either your contemporary, with a mind turned toward the same subjects, may find your ideas ingenious and forestall you in applying them, or he may have had other views on acids and fixed stars, and think ill of you in consequence. Mr. Gascoigne did not ask Mr. Arrowpoint if he had any trustworthy source of information about Grandcourt considered as a husband for a charming girl, nor did Mrs. Arrowpoint observe to Mrs. Davilow that if the possible peer sought a wife in the neighborhood of Diplow, the only reasonable expectation was that he would offer his hand to Catherine, who, however, would not accept him unless he were in all respects fitted to secure her happiness. Indeed, even to his wife the rector was silent as to the contemplation of any matrimonial result, from the probability that Mr. Grandcourt would see Gwendolen at the next archery meeting. Though Mrs. Gascoigne's mind was very likely still more active in the same direction. She had said interjectionally to her sister, "It would be a mercy, Fanny, if that girl were well married," to which Mrs. Davilow, discerning some criticism of her darling in the fervor of that wish, had not chosen to make any audible reply, though she had said inwardly, "You will not get her to marry for your pleasure," the mild mother becoming rather saucy when she identified herself with her daughter. To her husband Mrs. Gascoigne said, "I hear Mr. Grandcourt has got 2 places of his own, but he comes to Diplow for the hunting. It is to be hoped he will set a good example in the neighborhood. Have you heard what sort of a young man he is, Henry?" Mr. Gascoigne had not heard. At least, if his male acquaintances had gossiped in his hearing, he was not disposed to repeat their gossip, or to give it any emphasis in his own mind. He held it futile, even if it had been becoming, to show any curiosity as to the past of a young man whose birth, wealth, and consequent leisure made many habits venial which under other circumstances would have been inexcusable. Whatever Grandcourt had done, he had not ruined himself, and it is well known that in gambling, for example, whether of the business or holiday sort, a man who has the strength of mind to leave off when he has only ruined others is a reformed character. This is an illustration merely. Mr. Gascoigne had not heard that Grandcourt had been a gambler, and we can hardly pronounce him singular in feeling that a landed proprietor with a mixture of noble blood in his veins was not to be an object of suspicious inquiry, like a reformed character who offers himself as your butler or footman. Reformation, where a man can afford to do without it, can hardly be other than genuine. Moreover, it was not certain on any other showing hitherto that Mr. Grandcourt had needed reformation more than any other young men in the ripe youth of 35, and at any rate the significance of what he had been must be determined by what he actually was. Mrs. Davilow, too, although she would not respond to her sister's pregnant remark, could not be inwardly indifferent to an advent that might promise a brilliant lot for Gwendolen. A little speculation on what may be comes naturally without encouragement, comes inevitably in the form of images when unknown persons are mentioned. And Mr. Grandcourt's name raised in Mrs. Davilow's mind first of all the picture of a handsome, accomplished, excellent young man whom she would be satisfied with as a husband for her daughter. But then came the further speculation. Would Gwendolen be satisfied with him? There was no knowing what would meet that girl's taste or touch her affections. It might be something else than excellence, and thus the image of the perfect suitor gave way before a fluctuating combination of qualities that might be imagined to win Gwendolen's heart. In the difficulty of arriving at the particular combination which would ensure that result, the mother even said to herself, it would not signify about her being in love, if she would only accept the right person. For whatever marriage had been for herself, how could she the less desire it for her daughter? The difference her own misfortunes made was, that she never dared to dwell much to Gwendolen on the desirableness of marriage, dreading an answer something like that of the future Madame Roland, when her gentle mother, urging the acceptance of a suitor, said,
"Tu seras heureuse, ma chère. Oui, maman, comme toi."
In relation to the problematic Mr. Grandcourt, least of all would Mrs. Davilow have willingly let fall a hint of the aerial castle building which she had the good taste to be ashamed of, for such a hint was likely enough to give an adverse poise to Gwendolen's own thought, and make her detest the desirable husband beforehand. Since that scene after poor Rex's farewell visit, the mother had felt a new sense of peril in touching the mystery of her child's feeling, and in rationally determining what was her welfare. Only she could think of welfare in no other shape than marriage. The discussion of the dress that Gwendolen was to wear at the archery meeting was a relevant topic, however; and when it had been decided that as a touch of color on her white cashmere, nothing for her complexion was comparable to pale green, a feather which she was trying in her hat before the looking-glass having settled the question, Mrs. Davilow felt her ears tingle when Gwendolen, suddenly throwing herself into the attitude of drawing her bow, said with a look of comic enjoyment, "How I pity all the other girls at the archery meeting, all thinking of Mr. Grandcourt, and they have not a shadow of a chance." Mrs. Davilow had not the presence of mind to answer immediately, and Gwendolen turned round quickly toward her, saying wickedly, "Now you know they have not, mamma. You and my uncle and aunt, you all intend him to fall in love with me." Mrs. Davilow, piqued into a little stratagem, said, "Oh, my dear, that is not so certain. Miss Arrowpoint has charms which you have not." "I know, but they demand thought. My arrow will pierce him before he has time for thought. He will declare himself my slave. I shall send him round the world to bring me back the wedding ring of a happy woman. In the meantime, all the men who are between him and the title will die of different diseases. He will come back Lord Grandcourt, but without the ring, and fall at my feet. I shall laugh at him. He will rise in resentment. I shall laugh more. He will call for his steed and ride to Quetcham, where he will find Miss Arrowpoint just married to a needy musician, Mrs. Arrowpoint tearing her cap off, and Mr. Arrowpoint standing by. Exit Lord Grandcourt, who returns to Diplow, and, like Monsieur Jabot, change de ligne. Was ever any young witch like this? You thought of hiding things from her, sat upon your secret and looked innocent, and all the while she knew by the corner of your eye that it was exactly 5 pounds 10 you were sitting on. As well turn the key to keep out the damp. It was probable that by dint of divination she already knew more than any one else did of Mr. Grandcourt. That idea in Mrs. Davilow's mind prompted the sort of question which often comes without any other apparent reason than the faculty of speech and the not knowing what to do with it. "Why, what kind of man do you imagine him to be, Gwendolen?" "Let me see," said the witch, putting her forefinger to her lips with a little frown, and then stretching out the finger with decision. "Short, just above my shoulder, crying to make himself tall by turning up his mustache and keeping his beard long, a glass in his right eye to give him an air of distinction, a strong opinion about his waistcoat, but uncertain and trimming about the weather, on which he will try to draw me out. He will stare at me all the while, and the glass in his eye will cause him to make horrible faces, especially when he smiles in a flattering way. I shall cast down my eyes in consequence, and he will perceive that I am not indifferent to his attentions. I shall dream that night that I am looking at the extraordinary face of a magnified insect, and the next morning he will make an offer of his hand. The sequel as before. That is a portrait of some one you have already seen, Gwen. Mr. Grandcourt may be a delightful young man for what you know." "Oh, yes," said Gwendolen with a high note of careless admission, taking off her best hat and turning it round on her hand contemplatively. I wonder what sort of behavior a delightful young man would have. I know he would have hunters and racers, and a London house, and 2 country houses, one with battlements and another with a veranda, and I feel sure that with a little murdering he might get a title." The irony of this speech was of the doubtful sort that has some genuine belief mixed up with it. Poor Mrs. Davilow felt uncomfortable under it, her own meanings being usually literal and in intention innocent, and she said with a distressed brow, "Don't talk in that way, child, for heaven's sake. You do read such books. They give you such ideas of everything. I declare when your aunt and I were your age we knew nothing about wickedness. I think it was better so." "Why did you not bring me up in that way, mamma?" said Gwendolen. But immediately perceiving in the crushed look and rising sob that she had given a deep wound, she tossed down her hat and knelt at her mother's feet, crying, "Mamma, mamma, I was only speaking in fun. I meant nothing." "How could I, Gwendolen?" said poor Mrs. Davilow, unable to hear the retraction, and sobbing violently while she made the effort to speak. "Your will was always too strong for me. If everything else had been different." This disjoined logic was intelligible enough to the daughter. "Dear mamma, I don't find fault with you. I love you," said Gwendolen, really compunctious. "How can you help what I am? Besides, I am very charming. Come now." Here Gwendolen, with her handkerchief, gently rubbed away her mother's tears. "Really, I am contented with myself. I like myself better than I should have liked my aunt and you. How dreadfully dull you must have been!" Such tender cajolery served to quiet the mother as it had often done before after like collisions. Not that the collisions had often been repeated at the same point, for in the memory of both they left an association of dread with the particular topics which had occasioned them. Gwendolen dreaded the unpleasant sense of compunction toward her mother, which was the nearest approach to self-condemnation and self-distrust that she had known; and Mrs. Davilow's timid maternal conscience dreaded whatever had brought on the slightest hint of reproach. Hence, after this little scene, the two concurred in excluding Mr. Grandcourt from their conversation. When Mr. Gascoigne once or twice referred to him, Mrs. Davilow feared lest Gwendolen should betray some of her alarming keen-sightedness about what was probably in her uncle's mind. But the fear was not justified. Gwendolen knew certain differences in the characters with which she was concerned, as birds know climate and weather, and for the very reason that she was determined to evade her uncle's control, she was determined not to clash with him. The very understanding between them was much fostered by their enjoyment of archery together. Mr. Gascoigne was one of the best bowmen in Wessex, was gratified to find the elements of like skill in his niece, and Gwendolen was the more careful not to lose the shelter of his fatherly indulgence, because since the trouble with Rex both Mrs. Gascoigne and Anna had been unable to hide what she felt to be a very unreasonable alienation from her. Toward Anna she took some pains to behave with a regretful affectionateness, but neither of them dared to mention Rex's name, and Anna, whom the thought of him was part of the air she breathed, was ill at ease with the lively cousin who had ruined his happiness. She tried dutifully to repress any sign of her changed feeling, but who in pain can imitate the glance and hand-touch of pleasure? This unfair resentment had rather a hardening effect on Gwendolen, and threw her into a more defiant temper. Her uncle too might be offended if she refused the next person who fell in love with her, and one day when that idea was in her mind she said, "Mamma, I see now why girls are glad to be married, to escape being expected to please everybody but themselves." Happily Mr. Middleton was gone without having made any avowal, and notwithstanding the admiration for the handsome Miss Harleth, extending perhaps over 30 square miles in a part of Wessex well studded with families whose numbers included several disengaged young men, each glad to seat himself by the lively girl with whom it was so easy to get on in conversation, notwithstanding these grounds for arguing that Gwendolen was likely to have other suitors more explicit than the cautious curate, the fact was not so. Care has been taken not only that the trees should not sweep the stars down, but also that every man who admires a fair girl should not be enamored of her, and even that every man who is enamored should not necessarily declare himself. There are various refined shapes in which the price of corn, known to be potent cause in their relation, might, if inquired into, show why a young lady, perfect in person, accomplishments, and costume, has not the trouble of rejecting many offers. And nature's order is certainly benignant in not obliging us, one and all, to be desperately in love with the most admirable mortal we have ever seen. Gwendolen, we know, was far from holding that supremacy in the minds of all observers. Besides, it was but a poor 8 months since she had come to Offendene, and some inclinations become manifest slowly, like the sunward creeping of plants. In face of this fact, that not one of the eligible young men already in the neighborhood had made Gwendolen an offer, why should Mr. Grandcourt be thought of as likely to do what they had left undone? Perhaps because he was thought of as still more eligible, since a great deal of what passes for likelihood in the world is simply the reflex of a wish. Mr. and Mrs. Arrowpoint, for example, having no anxiety that Miss Harleth should make a brilliant marriage, had quite a different likelihood in their minds. End of chapter 9.
This recording is in the public domain.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda, by George Eliot.
Chapter 10. First Gentleman. What woman should be? Sir, consult the taste of marriageable men. This planet's store in iron, cotton, wool, or chemicals, all matter rendered to our plastic skill, is wrought in shapes responsive to demand. The market's pulse makes index high or low by rule sublime. Our daughters must be wives, and so the wives must be what men will choose. Men's taste is woman's test. You mark the phrase? 'Tis good, I think? The sense well winged and poised with T's and S's. Second Gentleman. Nay, but turn it round. Give us the test of taste. A fine menu? Is it today what Roman epicures insisted that a gentleman must eat to earn the dignity of dining well? Brackenshaw Park, where the archery meeting was held, looked out from its gentle heights far over the neighboring valley to the outlying eastern downs and the broad, slow rise of cultivated country, hanging like a vast curtain toward the west. The castle, which stood on the highest platform of the clustered hills, was built of rough-hewn limestone, full of lights and shadows made by the dark dust of lichens and the washings of the rain. Masses of beech and fir sheltered it on the north, and spread down here and there along the green slopes like flocks seeking the water which gleamed below. The archery ground was a carefully kept enclosure on a bit of table-land at the farthest end of the park, protected toward the southwest by tall elms and a thick screen of hollies, which kept the gravel walk and the bit of newly mown turf where the targets were placed in agreeable afternoon shade. The archery hall, with an arcade in front, showed like a white temple against the greenery on the north side. What could make a better background for the flower groups of ladies, moving and bowing and turning their necks as it would become the leisurely lilies to do if they took to locomotion? The sounds, too, were very pleasant to hear, even when the military band from Wanchester ceased to play. Musical laughs in all the registers, and a harmony of happy, friendly speeches, now rising toward mild excitement, now sinking to an agreeable murmur. No open-air amusement could be much freer from those noisy, crowding conditions which spoil most modern pleasures. No archery meeting could be more select, the number of friends accompanying the members being restricted by an award of tickets, so as to keep the maximum within the limits of convenience for the dinner and ball to be held in the castle. Within the enclosure no plebeian spectators were admitted except Lord Brackenshaw's tenants and their families, and of those it was chiefly the feminine members who used the privilege, bringing their little boys and girls or younger brothers and sisters. The males among them relieved the insipidity of the entertainment by imaginative betting, in which the stake was anything you like, on their favorite archers. But the young maidens, having a different principle of discrimination, were considering which of those sweetly dressed ladies they would choose to be, if the choice were allowed them. Probably the form these rural souls would most have striven for as a tabernacle was some other than Gwendolen's, one with more pink in her cheeks and hair of the most fashionable yellow. But among the male judges in the ranks immediately surrounding her there was unusual unanimity in pronouncing her the finest girl present. No wonder she enjoyed her existence on that July day. Preeminence is sweet to those who love it, even under mediocre circumstances. Perhaps it was not quite mythical that a slave has been proud to be bought first, and probably a barn door fowl on sale, though he may not have understood himself to be called the best of a bad lot, may have a self-informed consciousness of his relative importance, and strut consoled. But for complete enjoyment the outward and the inward must concur, and that concurrence was happening to Gwendolen. Who can deny that bows and arrows are among the prettiest weapons in the world for feminine forms to play with? They prompt attitudes full of grace and power, where that fine concentration of energy seen in all marksmanship is freed from associations of bloodshed. The time-honored British resources of killing something is no longer carried on with bow and quiver. Bands defending their passes against an invading nation fight under another sort of shade than a cloud of arrows, and poisoned darts are harmless survivals either in rhetoric or in regions comfortably remote. Archery has no ugly smell of brimstone, breaks nobody's shins, breeds no athletic monsters. Its only danger is that of failing, which for generous blood is enough to mold skillful action. And among the Brackenshaw archers the prizes were all of the nobler symbolic kind, not properly to be carried off in a parcel, degrading honor into gain, but the gold arrow and the silver, the gold star and the silver, to be worn for a long time in sign of achievement, and then transferred to the next who did excellently. These signs of preeminence had the virtue of wreaths without their inconveniences, which might have produced a melancholy effect in the heat of the ballroom. Altogether the Brackenshaw Archery Club was an institution framed with good taste, so as not to have by necessity any ridiculous incidents. And to-day all incalculable elements were in its favor. There was mild warmth, and no wind to disturb either hair or drapery or the course of the arrow. All skillful preparation had fair play, and when there was a general march to extract the arrows, the promenade of joyous young creatures in light speech and laughter, the graceful movement in common toward a common object, was a show worth looking at. Here Gwendolen seemed a Calypso among her nymphs. It was in her attitudes and movements that every one was obliged to admit her surpassing charm. "That girl is like a high-mettled racer," said Lord Brackenshaw to young Clintock, one of the invited spectators. "First chop. Tremendously pretty, too," said the elegant Grecian, who had been paying her assiduous attention. "I never saw her look better." Perhaps she had never looked so well. Her face was beaming with young pleasure in which there was no malign rays of discontent, for being satisfied with her own chances, she felt kindly toward everybody and was satisfied with the universe. Not to have the highest distinction in rank, not to be marked out as an heiress like Miss Arrowpoint, gave an added triumph in eclipsing those advantages. For personal recommendation she would not have cared to change the family group accompanying her for any other. Her mamma's appearance would have suited an amiable duchess. Her uncle and Aunt Gascoigne and Anna made equally gratifying figures in their way, and Gwendolen was too full of joyous belief in herself to feel in the least jealous, though Miss Arrowpoint was one of the best archeresses. Even the reappearance of the formidable Herr Klesmer, which caused some surprise in the rest of the company, seemed only to fall in with Gwendolen's inclination to be amused. Short of Apollo himself, what great musical maestro could make a good figure at an archery meeting? There was a very satirical light in Gwendolen's eyes as she looked toward the Arrowpoint party on their first entrance, when the contrast between Klesmer and the average group of English country people seemed at its utmost intensity in the close neighborhood of his hosts, or patrons, as Mrs. Arrowpoint would have liked to hear them called, that she might deny the possibility of any longer patronizing genius, its royalty being universally acknowledged. The contrast might have amused a graver personage than Gwendolen. We English are a miscellaneous people, and any chance 50 of us will present many varieties of animal architecture or facial ornament. But it must be admitted that our prevailing expression is not that of a lively, impassioned race, preoccupied with the ideal and carrying the real as a mere make-weight. The strong point of the English gentleman pure is the easy style of his figure and clothing. He objects to marked ins and outs in his costume, and he also objects to looking inspired. Fancy an assemblage where the men had all that ordinary stamp of the well-bred Englishman, watching the entrance of Herr Klesmer, his mane of hair floating backward in massive inconsistency with the chimney-pot hat, which had the look of having been put on for a joke above his pronounced but well-modeled features and powerful clear-shaven mouth and chin. His tall, thin figure clad in a way which, not being strictly English, was all the worse for its apparent emphasis of intention. Draped in a loose garment with a Florentine berretta on his head, he would have been fit to stand by the side of Leonardo da Vinci. But how when he presented himself in trousers which were not what English feeling demanded about the knees, and when the fire that showed itself in his glances and the movements of his head, as he looked round him with curiosity, was turned into comedy by a hat which ruled that mankind should have well-cropped hair and a staid demeanor, such, for example, as Mr. Arrowpoint's, whose nullity of face and perfect tailoring might pass everywhere without ridicule? One feels why it is often better for greatness to be dead, and to have got rid of the outward man. Many present knew Klesmer, or knew of him, but they had only seen him on candlelight occasions, when he appeared simply as a musician, and he had not yet that supreme world-wide celebrity which makes an artist great to the most ordinary people by their knowledge of his great expensiveness. It was literally a new light for them to see him in, presented unexpectedly on this July afternoon in an exclusive society. Some were inclined to laugh. Others felt a little disgust at the want of judgment shown by the Arrowpoints in this use of an introductory card. "What extreme guys those artistic fellows are," said young Clintock to Gwendolen. "Do look at the figure he cuts, bowing with his hand on his heart to Lady Brackenshaw, and Mrs. Arrowpoint's feather just reaching his shoulder." "You are one of the profane," said Gwendolen. "You are blind to the majesty of genius. Herr Klesmer smites me with awe. I feel crushed in his presence. My courage all oozes from me." "Ah, you understand all about his music." "No, indeed," said Gwendolen, with a light laugh. "It is he who understands all about mine and thinks it's pitiable." Klesmer's verdict on her singing had been an easier joke to her since he had been struck by her plastique. "It is not addressed to the ears of the future, I suppose. I'm glad of that. It suits mine." "Oh, you are very kind. But how remarkably well Miss Arrowpoint looks to-day. She would make quite a fine picture in that gold-colored dress." "Too splendid, don't you think?" "Well, perhaps a little too symbolical. Too much like the figure of Wealth in an allegory." This speech of Gwendolen's had rather a malicious sound, but it was not really more than a bubble of fun. She did not wish Miss Arrowpoint or any one else to be out of the way, believing in her own good fortune even more than in her skill. The belief in both naturally grew stronger as the shooting went on, for she promised to achieve one of the best scores, a success which astonished every one in a new member; and to Gwendolen's temperament one success determined another. She trod on air, and all things pleasant seemed possible. The hour was enough for her, and she was not obliged to think what she should do next to keep her life at the due pitch. "How does the scoring stand, I wonder?" said Lady Brackenshaw, a gracious personage who, adorned with two little girls and a boy of stout make, sat as lady paramount. Her lord had come up to her in one of the intervals of shooting. Seems to me that Miss Harleth is likely to win the gold arrow." "Gad, I think she will if she carries it on. She is running Juliet Fenn hard. It is wonderful for one in her first year. Catherine is not up to her usual mark," continued his lordship, turning to the heiress's mother, who sat near. "But she got the gold arrow last time, and there's a luck even in these games of skill. That's better. It gives the hinder ones a chance." "Catherine will be very glad for others to win," said Mrs. Arrowpoint. "She is so magnanimous. It was entirely her considerateness that made us bring Herr Klesmer instead of Canon Stopley, who had expressed a wish to come. For her own pleasure I am sure she would rather have brought the Canon, but she is always thinking of others. I told her it was not quite en règle to bring one so far out of our own set, but she said, 'Genius itself is not en règle. It comes into the world to make new rules.' And one must admit that." "Ay, to be sure," said Lord Brackenshaw, in a tone of careless dismissal, adding quickly, "For my part, I am not magnanimous. I should like to win, but confound it, I never have the chance now. I'm getting old and idle. The young ones beat me. As old Nestor says, the gods don't give us everything at one time. I was a young fellow once, and now I'm getting an old and wise one. Old at any rate, which is a gift that comes to everybody if they live long enough, so it raises no jealousy." The Earl smiled comfortably at his wife. "Oh, my lord, people who have been neighbors 20 years must not talk to each other about age," said Mrs. Arrowpoint. "Years, as the Tuscans say, are made for the letting of houses. But where is our new neighbor? I thought Mr. Grandcourt was to be here to-day." "Ah, by the way, so he was. The time's getting on, too," said his lordship, looking at his watch. "But he only got to Diplow the other day. He came to us on Tuesday and said he had been a little bothered. He may have been pulled in another direction." "Why, Gascoigne!" The rector was just then crossing at a little distance with Gwendolen on his arm, and turned in compliance with the call. "This is a little too bad. You not only beat us yourself, but you bring up your niece to beat all the archeresses." "It is rather scandalous in her to get the better of elder members," said Mr. Gascoigne, with much inward satisfaction, curling his short upper lip. "But it is not my doing, my lord. I only meant her to make a tolerable figure without surpassing any one." "It is not my fault either," said Gwendolen, with pretty archness. "If I am to aim, I can't help hitting." "Ay, ay, that may be a fatal business for some people," said Lord Brackenshaw good-humoredly. Then taking out his watch and looking at Mrs. Arrowpoint again, "The time's getting on, as you say, but Grandcourt is always late. I notice in town he's always late, and he's no bowman, understands nothing about it. But I told him he must come. He would see the flower of the neighborhood here. He asked about you, had seen Arrowpoint's card. I think you had not made his acquaintance in town. He has been a good deal abroad. People don't know him much." "No, we are strangers," said Mrs. Arrowpoint, "but that is not what might have been expected. For his uncle, Sir Hugo Mallinger, and I are great friends when we meet." "I don't know. Uncles and nephews are not so likely to be seen together as uncles and nieces," said his lordship, smiling toward the rector. "But just come with me one instant, Gascoigne, will you? I want to speak a word about the clout shooting." Gwendolen chose to go too and be deposited in the same group with her mamma and aunt until she had to shoot again. That Mr. Grandcourt might after all not appear on the archery ground had begun to enter into Gwendolen's thought as a possible deduction from the completeness of her pleasure. Under all her saucy satire, provoked chiefly by her divination that her friends thought of him as a desirable match for her, she felt something very far from indifference as to the impression she would make on him. True, he was not to have the slightest power over her, for Gwendolen had not considered that the desire to conquer is itself a sort of subjection. She had made up her mind that he was to be one of those complimentary and assiduously admiring men of whom even her narrow experience had shown her several, with various colored beards and various styles of bearing. And the sense that her friends would want her to think him delightful gave her a resistant inclination to presuppose him ridiculous. But that was no reason why she could spare his presence, and even a passing prevision of trouble in case she despised and refused him raised not the shadow of a wish that he should save her that trouble by showing no disposition to make her an offer. Mr. Grandcourt, hardly taking any notice of her, and becoming shortly engaged to Miss Arrowpoint, was not a picture which flattered her imagination. Hence Gwendolen had been all ear to Lord Brackenshaw's mode of accounting for Grandcourt's non-appearance; and when he did arrive, no consciousness, not even Mrs. Arrowpoint's or Mr. Gascoigne's, was more awake to the fact than hers, although she steadily avoided looking toward any point where he was likely to be. There should be no slightest shifting of angles to betray that it was of any consequence to her whether the much talked of Mr. Mallinger Grandcourt presented himself or not. She became again absorbed in the shooting, and so resolutely abstained from looking round observantly, that even supposing him to have taken a conspicuous place among the spectators, it might be clear she was not aware of him. And all the while the certainty that he was there made a distinct thread in her consciousness. Perhaps her shooting was the better for it. At any rate, it gained in precision, and she at last raised a delightful storm of clapping and applause by 3 hits running in the gold, a feat which among the Brackenshaw arches had not the vulgar reward of a shilling poll tax, but that of a special gold star to be worn on the breast. That moment was not only a happy one to herself, it was just what her mamma and her uncle would have chosen for her. There was a general falling into ranks to give her space that she might advance conspicuously to receive the gold star from the hands of Lady Brackenshaw; and the perfect movement of her fine form was certainly a pleasant thing to behold in the clear afternoon light when the shadows were long and still. She was the central object of that pretty picture, and every one present must gaze at her. That was enough. She herself was determined to see nobody in particular, or to turn her eyes any way except toward Lady Brackenshaw, but her thoughts undeniably turned in other ways. It entered a little into her pleasure that Herr Klesmer must be observing her at a moment when music was out of the question, and his superiority very far in the background; for vanity is as ill at ease under indifference as tenderness is under a love which it cannot return. And the unconquered Klesmer threw a trace of his malign power even across her pleasant consciousness that Mr. Grandcourt was seeing her to the utmost advantage, and was probably giving her an admiration unmixed with criticism. She did not expect to admire him, but that was not necessary to her peace of mind. Gwendolen met Lady Brackenshaw's gracious smile without blushing, which only came to her when she was taken by surprise, but with a charming gladness of expression, and then bent with easy grace to have the star fixed near her shoulder. That little ceremony had been over long enough for her to have exchanged playful speeches and received congratulations as she moved among the groups who were now interesting themselves in the results of the scoring. But it happened that she stood outside examining the point of an arrow, with rather an absent air, when Lord Brackenshaw came up to her and said, "Miss Harleth, here is a gentleman who is not willing to wait any longer for an introduction. He has been getting Mrs. Davilow to send me with him. Will you allow me to introduce Mr. Mallinger Grandcourt?" End of Chapter 10.
End of Book 1. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Book 2. Meeting Streams. Chapter 11. The beginning of an acquaintance, whether with persons or things, is to get a definite outline for our ignorance. Mr. Grandcourt's wish to be introduced had no suddenness for Gwendolen, but when Lord Brackenshaw moved aside a little for the prefigured stranger to come forward, and she felt herself face to face with the real man, there was a little shock which flushed her cheeks and vexatiously deepened with her consciousness of it. The shock came from the reversal of her expectations. Grandcourt could hardly have been more unlike all her imaginary portraits of him. He was slightly taller than herself, and their eyes seemed to be on a level. There was not the faintest smile on his face as he looked at her, not a trace of self-consciousness or anxiety in his bearing. When he raised his hat, he showed an extensive baldness surrounded with a mere fringe of reddish blonde hair. But he also showed a perfect hand. The line of feature from brow to chin, undisguised by beard, was decidedly handsome, with only moderate departures from the perpendicular, and the slight whisker, too, was perpendicular. It was not possible for a human aspect to be freer from grimace or solicitous wrigglings. Also, it was perhaps not possible for a breathing man wide awake to look less animated. The correct Englishman, drawing himself up from his bow into rigidity, assenting severely, and seemed to be in a state of internal drill, suggests a suppressed vivacity, and may be suspected of letting go with some violence when he is released from parade. But Grandcourt's bearing had no rigidity. It inclined rather to the flaccid. His complexion had a faded fairness resembling that of an actress when bare of the artificial white and red. His long narrow gray eyes expressed nothing but indifference. Attempts at description are stupid. Who can all at once describe a human being? Even when he is presented to us, we only begin that knowledge of his appearance which must be completed by innumerable impressions under differing circumstances. We recognize the alphabet. We are not sure of the language. I am only mentioning the point that Gwendolen saw by the light of a prepared contrast in the first minutes of her meeting with Grandcourt. They were summed up in the words, "He is not ridiculous." But forthwith Lord Brackenshaw was gone, and what is called conversation had begun, the first and constant element in it being that Grandcourt looked at Gwendolen persistently, with a slightly exploring gaze, but without change of expression, while she only occasionally looked at him with a flash of observation, a little softened by coquetry. Also after her answers there was a longer or shorter pause before he spoke again. "I used to think archery was a great bore," Grandcourt began. He spoke with a fine accent, but with a certain broken drawl, as of a distinguished personage with a distinguished cold on his chest. "Are you converted to-day?" said Gwendolen. Pause, during which she imagined various degrees and modes of opinion about herself that might be entertained by Grandcourt. "Yes, since I saw you shooting. In things of this sort one generally sees people missing and simpering." "I suppose you are a first-rate shot with a rifle." Pause, during which Gwendolen, having taken a rapid observation of Grandcourt, made a brief graphic description of him to an indefinite hearer. "I have left off shooting." "Oh, then you are a formidable person. People who have done things once and left them off make one feel very contemptible, as if one were using cast-off fashions. I hope you have not left off all follies, because I practice a great many." Pause, during which Gwendolen made several interpretations of her own speech. "What do you call follies?" "Well, in general, I think, whatever is agreeable is called a folly. But you have not left off hunting, I hear." Pause, wherein Gwendolen recalled what she had heard about Grandcourt's position, and decided that he was the most aristocratic-looking man she had ever seen. "One must do something." "And do you care about the turf, or is that among the things you have left off?" Pause, during which Gwendolen thought that a man of extremely calm, cold manners might be less disagreeable as a husband than other men, and not likely to interfere with his wife's preferences. "I run a horse now and then, but I don't go in for the thing as some men do. Are you fond of horses?" "Yes, indeed. I never like my life so well as when I am on horseback, having a great gallop. I think of nothing. I only feel myself strong and happy." Pause, wherein Gwendolen wondered whether Grandcourt would like what she said, but assured herself that she was not going to disguise her tastes. "Do you like danger?" "I don't know. When I am on horseback I never think of danger. It seems to me that if I broke my bones I should not feel it. I should go at anything that came in my way." Pause, during which Gwendolen had run through a whole hunting season with 2 chosen hunters to ride at will. "You would perhaps like tiger hunting or pig sticking. I saw some of that for a season or 2 in the East. Everything here is poor stuff after that." You are fond of danger, then?" Pause, wherein Gwendolen speculated on the probability that the men of coldest manners were the most adventurous, and felt the strength of her own insight, supposing the question had to be decided. "One must have something or other, but one gets used to it." "I begin to think I am very fortunate, because everything is new to me. It is only that I cannot get enough of it. I am not used to anything except being dull, which I should like to leave off, as you have left off shooting." Pause, during which it occurred to Gwendolen that a man of cold and distinguished manners might possibly be a dull companion. But on the other hand, she thought that most persons were dull, that she had not observed husbands to be companions, and that after all she was not going to accept Grandcourt. "Why are you dull?" "This is a dreadful neighborhood. There is nothing to be done in it. That is why I practiced my archery." Pause, during which Gwendolen reflected that the life of an unmarried woman who could not go about and had no command of anything must necessarily be dull through all degrees of comparison as time went on. "You have made yourself a queen of it. I imagine you will carry the first prize." "I don't know that. I have great rivals. Did you not observe how well Miss Arrowpoint shot?" Pause, wherein Gwendolen was thinking that men had been known to choose some one else than the woman they most admired, and recalled several experiences of that kind in novels. "Miss Arrowpoint? No—that is, yes." "Shall we go now and hear what the scoring says? Every one is going to the other end now. Shall we join them? I think my uncle is looking toward me. He perhaps wants me." Gwendolen found a relief for herself by thus changing the situation. Not that the tête-à-tête was quite disagreeable to her, but while it lasted she apparently could not get rid of the unwonted flush in her cheeks and the sense of surprise which made her feel less mistress of herself than usual. And this Mr. Grandcourt, who seemed to feel his own importance more than he did hers, a sort of unreasonableness few of us can tolerate, must not take for granted that he was of great moment to her, or that because others speculated on him as a desirable match, she held herself altogether at his beck. How Grandcourt had filled up the pauses will be more evident hereafter. "You have just missed the gold arrow, Gwendolen," said Mr. Gascoigne. "Miss Juliet Fenn scores 8 above you." "I am very glad to hear it. I should have felt that I was making myself too disagreeable, taking the best of everything," said Gwendolen, quite easily. It was impossible to be jealous of Juliet Fenn, a girl as middling as midday market in everything but her archery and plainness, in which last she was noticeable like her father, underhung and with receding brow resembling that of the more intelligent fishes. Surely, considering the importance which is given to such an accident in female offspring, marriageable men, or what the New English calls intending bridegrooms, should look at themselves dispassionately in the glass, since their natural selection of a mate prettier than themselves is not certain to bar the effect of their own ugliness. There was now a lively movement in the mingling groups which carried the talk along with it. Every one spoke to every one else by turns, and Gwendolen, who chose to see what was going on around her now, observed that Grandcourt was having klezmer presented to him by some one unknown to her, a middle-aged man with dark full face and fat hands, who seemed to be on the easiest terms with both, and presently led the way in joining the Arrowpoints, whose acquaintance had already been made by both him and Grandcourt. Who this stranger was she did not care much to know, but she wished to observe what was Grandcourt's manner toward others than herself. Precisely the same, except that he did not look much at Miss Arrowpoint, but rather at Klesmer, who was speaking with animation, now stretching out his long fingers horizontally, now pointing downward with his forefinger, now folding his arms and tossing his mane, while he addressed himself first to one and then to the other, including Grandcourt, who listened with an impassive face and narrow eyes, his left forefinger in his waistcoat pocket, and his right slightly touching his thin whisker. "I wonder which style Miss Arrowpoint admires most," was a thought that glanced through Gwendolen's mind, while her eyes and lips gathered rather a mocking expression. But she would not indulge her sense of amusement by watching as if she were curious. and she gave all her animation to those immediately around her, determined not to care whether Mr. Grandcourt came near her again or not. He did not come, however, and at a moment when he could propose to conduct Mrs. Davilow to her carriage. "Shall we meet again in the ballroom?" she said as he raised his hat at parting. The yes in reply had the usual slight drawl and perfect gravity. "You were wrong for once, Gwendolen," said Mrs. Davilow during their few minutes' drive to the castle. "In what, mamma?" "About Mr. Grandcourt's appearance and manners. You can't find anything ridiculous in him." "I suppose I could if I tried, but I don't want to do it," said Gwendolen rather pettishly, and her mother was afraid to say more. It was the rule on these occasions for the ladies and gentlemen to dine apart, so that the dinner might make a time of comparative ease and rest for both. Indeed, the gentlemen had a set of archery stories about the epicurism of the ladies, who had somehow been reported to show a revolting masculine judgment in venison, even asking for the fat, proof of the frightful rate at which corruption might go in women, but for severe social restraint. And every year the amiable Lord Brackenshaw, who was something of a gourmet, mentioned Byron's opinion that a woman should never be seen eating, introducing it with a confidential "the fact is," as if he were for the first time admitting his concurrence in that sentiment of the refined poet. In the ladies' dining-room it was evident that Gwendolen was not a general favorite with her own sex. There were no beginnings of intimacy between her and other girls, and in conversation they rather noticed what she said than spoke to her in free exchange. Perhaps it was that she was not much interested in them, and when left alone in their company had a sense of empty benches. Mrs. Vulcany once remarked that Miss Harleth was too fond of the gentlemen. But we know that she was not in the least fond of them. She was only fond of their homage, and women did not give her homage. The exception to this willing aloofness from her was Miss Arrowpoint, who often managed unostentatiously to be by her side, and talked to her with quiet friendliness. "She knows, as I do, that our friends are ready to quarrel over a husband for us," thought Gwendolen, "and she is determined not to enter into the quarrel." "I think Miss Arrowpoint has the best manners I ever saw," said Mrs. Davilow when she and Gwendolen were in a dressing-room with Mrs. Gascoigne and Anna, but at a distance where they could have their talk apart. "I wish I were like her," said Gwendolen. "Why? Are you getting discontented with yourself, Gwen?" "No, but I'm discontented with things. She seems contented." "I am sure you ought to be satisfied to day. You must have enjoyed the shooting. I saw you did." "Oh, that is over now, and I don't know what will come next," said Gwendolen, stretching herself with a sort of moan and throwing up her arms. They were bare now. It was the fashion to dance in the archery dress, throwing off the jacket, and the simplicity of her white cashmere with its border of pale green set off her form to the utmost. A thin line of gold round her neck and the gold star on her breast were her only ornaments. Her smooth, soft hair piled up into a grand crown made a clear line about her brow. Sir Joshua would have been glad to take her portrait, and he would have had an easier task than the historian, at least in this, that he would not have had to represent the truth of change, only to give stability to one beautiful moment. "The dancing will come next," said Mrs. Davilow. "You be sure to enjoy that." "I shall only dance in the quadrille. I told Mr. Clintock so. I shall not waltz or polk with any one." "Why in the world do you say that all on a sudden?" "I can't bear having ugly people so near me." "Whom do you mean by ugly people?" "Oh, plenty." "Mr. Clintock, for example, is not ugly." Mrs. Davilow dared not mention Grandcourt. "Well, I hate woolen cloth touching me." "Fancy," said Mrs. Davilow to her sister, who now came up from the other end of the room, "Gwendolen says she will not waltz or polk." "She is rather given to whims, I think," said Mrs. Gascoigne gravely. "It would be more becoming in her to behave as other young ladies do on such an occasion as this, especially when she has had the advantage of first-rate dancing lessons." "Why should I dance if I don't like it, aunt? It is not in the catechism." "My dear," said Mrs. Gascoigne, in a tone of severe check, and Anna looked frightened at Gwendolen's daring, but they all passed on without saying any more. Apparently something had changed Gwendolen's mood since the hour of exulting enjoyment in the archery ground, but she did not look the worse under the chandeliers in the ballroom, where the soft splendor of the scene and the pleasant odors from the conservatory could not but be soothing to the temper, when accompanied with the consciousness of being preeminently sought for. Hardly a dancing man but was anxious to have her for a partner, and each whom she accepted was in a state of melancholy remonstrance that she would not waltz or polk. "Are you under a vow, Miss Harleth? Why are you so cruel to us all? You waltzed with me in February, and you who waltz so perfectly," were exclamations not without piquancy for her. The ladies who waltzed naturally thought that Miss Harleth only wanted to make herself particular, but her uncle, when he overheard her refusal, supported her by saying, "Gwendolen has usually good reasons." He thought she was certainly more distinguished in not waltzing, and he wished her to be distinguished. The archery ball was intended to be kept at the subdued pitch that suited all dignities clerical and secular. It was not an escapement for youthful high spirits, and he himself was of opinion that the fashionable dances were too much of a romp. Among the remonstrant dancing men, however, Mr. Grandcourt was not numbered. After standing up for a quadrille with Miss Arrowpoint, it seemed that he meant to ask for no other partner. Gwendolen observed him frequently with the Arrowpoints, but he never took an opportunity of approaching her. Mr. Gascoigne was sometimes speaking to him, but Mr. Gascoigne was everywhere. It was in her mind now that she would probably after all not have the least trouble about him. Perhaps he had looked at her without any particular admiration, and was too much used to everything in the world to think of her as more than one of the girls who were invited in that part of the country. Of course, it was ridiculous of elders to entertain notions about what a man would do, without having seen him even through a telescope. Probably he meant to marry Miss Arrowpoint. Whatever might come, she, Gwendolen, was not going to be disappointed. The affair was a joke whichever way it turned, for she had never committed herself even by a silent confidence in anything Mr. Grandcourt would do. Still, she noticed that he did sometimes quietly and gradually change his position, according to hers, so that he could see her whenever she was dancing; and if he did not admire her, so much the worse for him. This movement, for the sake of being in sight of her, was more direct than usual rather late in the evening, when Gwendolen had accepted Klesmer as a partner, and that wide-glancing personage, who saw everything and nothing by turns, said to her when they were walking, "Mr. Grandcourt is a man of taste. He likes to see you dancing." "Perhaps he likes to look at what is against his taste," said Gwendolen, with a light laugh. She was quite courageous with Klesmer now. "He may be so tired of admiring that he likes disgust for variety." "Those words are not suitable to your lips," said Klesmer quickly, with one of his grand frowns, while he shook his hand as if to banish the discordant sounds. "Are you as critical of words as of music?" "Certainly I am. I should require your words to be what your face and form are, always among the meanings of a noble music." "That is a compliment as well as a correction. I am obliged for both. But do you know I am bold enough to wish to correct you, and require you to understand a joke?" "One may understand jokes without liking them," said the terrible Klesmer. "I have had opera books sent me full of jokes. It was just because I understood them that I did not like them. The comic people are ready to challenge a man because he looks grave. 'You don't see the witticism, sir.' 'No, sir, but I see what you meant.' Then I am what we call ticketed as a fellow without esprit. But in fact," said Klesmer, suddenly dropping from his quick narrative to a reflective tone, with an impressive frown, "I am very sensible to wit and humor." "I am glad you tell me that," said Gwendolen, not without some wickedness of intention. But Klesmer's thoughts had flown off on the wings of his own statement, as their habit was, and she had the wickedness all to herself. "Pray, who is that standing near the card-room door?" she went on, seeing there the same stranger with whom Klesmer had been in animated talk on the archery ground. "He is a friend of yours, I think." "No, no, an amateur I have seen in town. Lush, a Mr. Lush, too fond of Meyerbeer and Scribe, too fond of the mechanical dramatic." "Thanks. I wanted to know whether you thought his face and form required that his words should be among the meanings of noble music." Klesmer was conquered, and flashed at her a delightful smile which made them quite friendly until she begged to be deposited by the side of her mamma. 3 minutes afterward her preparations for Grandcourt's indifference were all canceled. Turning her head after some remark to her mother, she found that he had made his way up to her. "May I ask if you are tired of dancing, Miss Harleth?" he began, looking down with his former unperturbed expression. "Not in the least. Will you do me the honor—the next—or another quadrille?" "I should have been very happy," said Gwendolen, looking at her card, "but I am engaged for the next to Mr. Clintock. And indeed I perceive that I am doomed for every quadrille. I have not one to dispose of." She was not sorry to punish Mr. Grandcourt's tardiness, yet at the same time she would have liked to dance with him. She gave him a charming smile as she looked up to deliver her answer, and he stood still looking down at her with no smile at all. "I am unfortunate in being too late," he said, after a moment's pause. "It seemed to me that you did not care for dancing," said Gwendolen. "I thought it might be one of the things you had left off." "Yes, but I have not begun to dance with you," said Grandcourt. Always there was the same pause before he took up his cue. "You make dancing a new thing, as you make archery. Is novelty always agreeable?" "No, no, not always." "Then I don't know whether to feel flattered or not. When you had once danced with me there would be no more novelty in it." "On the contrary, there would probably be much more." "That is deep. I don't understand. It is difficult to make Miss Harleth understand her power?" Here Grandcourt had turned to Mrs. Davilow, who, smiling gently at her daughter, said, "I think she does not generally strike people as slow to understand." "Mamma," said Gwendolen, in a deprecating tone, "I am adorably stupid, and want everything explained to me when the meaning is pleasant." "If you are stupid, I admit that stupidity is adorable," returned Grandcourt, after the usual pause and without change of tone. But clearly he knew what to say. "I begin to think that my cavalier has forgotten me," Gwendolen observed after a little while. "I see the quadrille is being formed." "He deserves to be renounced," said Grandcourt. "I think he is very pardonable," said Gwendolen. "There must have been some misunderstanding," said Mrs. Davilow. "Mr. Clintock was too anxious about the engagement to have forgotten it." But now Lady Brackenshaw came up and said, "Miss Harleth, Mr. Clintock has charged me to express to you his deep regret that he was obliged to leave without having the pleasure of dancing with you again. An express came from his father, the archdeacon, something important. He was to go. He was au désespoir." "Oh, he was very good to remember the engagement under the circumstances," said Gwendolen. "I am sorry he was called away." It was easy to be politely sorrowful on so felicitous an occasion. "Then I can profit by Mr. Clintock's misfortune," said Grandcourt. "May I hope that you will let me take his place?" "I shall be very happy to dance the next quadrille with you." The appropriateness of the event seemed an augury, and as Gwendolen stood up for the quadrille with Grandcourt, there was a revival in her of the exultation, the sense of carrying everything before her which she had felt earlier in the day. No man could have walked through the quadrille with more irreproachable ease than Grandcourt, and the absence of all eagerness in his attention to her suited his partner's taste. She was now convinced that he meant to distinguish her, to mark his admiration of her in a noticeable way, and it began to appear probable that she would have it in her power to reject him, whence there was a pleasure in reckoning up the advantages which would make her rejection splendid, and in giving Mr. Grandcourt his utmost value. It was also agreeable to divine that this exclusive selection of her to dance with, from among all the unmarried ladies present, would attract observation, though she studiously avoided seeing this, and at the end of the quadrille walked away on Grandcourt's arm as if she had been one of the shortest-sighted instead of the longest and widest-sighted of mortals. They encountered Miss Arrowpoint, who was standing with Lady Brackenshaw and a group of gentlemen. The heiress looked at Gwendolen invitingly and said, "I hope you will vote with us, Miss Harleth, and Mr. Grandcourt too, though he is not an archer." Gwendolen and Grandcourt paused to join the group, and found that the voting turned on the project of a picnic archery meeting to be held in Cardell Chase, where the evening entertainment would be more poetic than a ball, under chandeliers, a feast of sunset lights along the glades and through the branches and over the solemn tree tops. Gwendolen thought the scheme delightful, equal to playing Robin Hood and Maid Marian. and Mr. Grandcourt, when appealed to a second time, said it was a thing to be done. Whereupon Mr. Lush, who stood behind Lady Brackenshaw's elbow, drew Gwendolen's notice by saying with a familiar look and tone to Grandcourt, "Diplow would be a good place for the meeting, and more convenient. There's a fine bit between the oaks toward the north gate." Impossible to look more unconscious of being addressed than Grandcourt, but Gwendolen took a new survey of the speaker, deciding first that he must be on terms of intimacy with the tenant of Diplow, and secondly that she would never, if she could help it, let him come within a yard of her. She was subject to physical antipathies, and Mr. Lush's prominent eyes, fat though not clumsy figure, and strong black gray-besprinkled hair of frizzy thickness, which with the rest of his prosperous person was enviable to many, created one of the strongest of her antipathies. To be safe from his looking at her, she murmured to Grandcourt, "I should like to continue walking." He obeyed immediately, but when they were thus away from any audience, he spoke no word for several minutes, and she, out of a half-amused, half-serious inclination for experiment, would not speak first. They turned into the large conservatory, beautifully lit up with Chinese lamps. The other couples there were at a distance, which would not have interfered with any dialogue, but still they walked in silence until they had reached the farther end, where there was a flush of pink light, and the second wide opening into the ball-room. Grandcourt, when they had half turned round, paused and said languidly, "Do you like this kind of thing?" If the situation had been described to Gwendolen half an hour before, she would have laughed heartily at it, and could only have imagined herself returning a playful, satirical answer. But for some mysterious reason—it was a mystery of which she had a faint wondering consciousness—she dared not be satirical. She had begun to feel a wand over her that made her afraid of offending Grandcourt. "Yes," she said quietly, without considering what kind of thing was meant, whether the flowers, the scents, the ball in general, or this episode of walking with Mr. Grandcourt in particular. And they returned along the conservatory without farther interpretation. She then proposed to go and sit down in her old place, and they walked among scattered couples preparing for the waltz to the spot where Mrs. Davilow had been seated all the evening. As they approached it, her seat was vacant, but she was coming toward it again, and, to Gwendolen's shuddering annoyance, with Mr. Lush at her elbow. There was no avoiding the confrontation. Her mamma came close to her before they had reached the seats, and after a quiet greeting, Smile said innocently, "Gwendolen, dear, let me present Mr. Lush to you." Having just made the acquaintance of this personage as an intimate and constant companion of Mr. Grandcourt's, Mrs. Davilow imagined it altogether desirable that her daughter also should make the acquaintance. It was hardly a bow that Gwendolen gave; rather it was the slightest forward sweep of the head away from the physiognomy that inclined itself toward her, and she immediately moved toward her seat, saying, "I want to put on my burnous." No sooner had she reached it than Mr. Lush was there, and had the burnous in his hand. To annoy the supercilious young lady, he would incur the offense of forestalling Grandcourt, and holding up the garment close to Gwendolen, he said, "Pray permit me." But she, wheeling away from him as if he had been a muddy hound, glided on to the ottoman, saying, "No, thank you." A man who forgave this would have much Christian feeling, supposing he had intended to be agreeable to the young lady; but before he seized the burnous, Mr. Lush had ceased to have that intention. Grandcourt quietly took the drapery from him, and Mr. Lush, with a slight bow, moved away. "You had perhaps better put it on," said Mr. Grandcourt, looking down on her without change of expression. "Thanks, perhaps it would be wise," said Gwendolen, rising and submitting very gracefully to take the burnous on her shoulders. After that Mr. Grandcourt exchanged a few polite speeches with Mrs. Davilow, and in taking leave asked permission to call at Offendene the next day. He was evidently not offended by the insult directed toward his friend. Certainly Gwendolen's refusal of the burnous from Mr. Lush was open to the interpretation that she wished to receive it from Mr. Grandcourt. But she, poor child, had no design in this action, and was simply following her antipathy and inclination, confiding in them as she did in the more reflective judgments into which they entered as sap into leafage.
Gwendolen had no sense that these men were dark enigmas to her, or that she needed any help in drawing conclusions about them—Mr. Grandcourt at least. The chief question was, how far his character and ways might answer her wishes; and unless she were satisfied about that, she had said to herself that she would not accept his offer. Could there be a slenderer, more insignificant thread in human history than this consciousness of a girl, busy with her small inferences of the way in which she could make her life pleasant? In a time, too, when ideas were with fresh vigor making armies of themselves, and the universal kinship was declaring itself fiercely; when women on the other side of the world would not mourn for the husbands and sons who died bravely in a common cause, and men stinted of bread on our side of the world heard of that willing loss and were patient; a time when the soul of man was walking to pulses which had for centuries been beating in him unfelt, until their full sum made a new life of terror or of joy. What in the midst of that mighty drama are girls and their blind visions? They are the yea or nay of that good for which men are enduring and fighting. In these delicate vessels is borne onward through the ages the treasure of human affections. End of chapter 11.
This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 12. O gentlemen, the time of life is short. To spend that shortness basely were too long, if life did ride upon a dial's point, still ending at the arrival of an hour. Shakespeare, Henry IV. On the second day after the archery meeting, Mr. Henleigh Mallinger Grandcourt was at his breakfast table with Mr. Lush. Everything around them was agreeable. The summer air through the open windows, at which the dogs could walk in from the old green turf on the lawn; the soft purplish coloring of the park beyond, stretching toward a mass of bordering wood; the still life in the room, which seemed the stiller for its sober antiquated elegance, as if it kept a conscious well-bred silence, unlike the restlessness of vulgar furniture. Whether the gentlemen were agreeable to each other was less evident. Mr. Grandcourt had drawn his chair aside so as to face the lawn, and with his left leg over another chair and his right elbow on the table, was smoking a large cigar, while his companion was still eating. The dogs, half a dozen of various kinds, were moving lazily in and out, taking attitudes of brief attention, gave a vacillating preference first to one gentleman, then to the other, being dogs in such good circumstances that they could play at hunger, and liked to be served with delicacies which they declined to put in their mouths. All except Fetch, the beautiful liver-colored water-spaniel, which sat with its forepaws firmly planted and its expressive brown face turned upward, watching Grandcourt with unshaken constancy. He held in his lap a tiny Maltese dog with a tiny silver collar and bell, and when he had a hand unused by cigar or coffee-cup, it rested on this small parcel of animal warmth. I fear that Fetch was jealous, and wounded that her master gave her no word or look. At last it seemed that she could bear this neglect no longer, and she gently put her large silky paw on her master's leg. Grandcourt looked at her with unchanged face for half a minute, and then took the trouble to lay down his cigar, while he lifted the unimpassioned Fluff close to his chin and gave it caressing pats, all the while gravely watching Fetch, who, poor thing, whimpered interruptedly, as if trying to repress that sign of discontent, and at last rested her head beside the appealing paw, looking up with piteous beseeching. So, at least, a lover of dogs must have interpreted Fetch, and Grandcourt kept so many dogs that he was reputed to love them. At any rate, his impulse to act just in that way started from such an interpretation. But when the amusing anguish burst forth in a howling bark, Grandcourt pushed Fetch down without speaking, and depositing Fluff carelessly on the table, where his black nose predominated over a salt cellar, began to look to his cigar, and found with some annoyance against Fetch as the cause, that the brute of a cigar required relighting. Fetch, having begun to wail, found, like others of her sex, that it was not easy to leave off. Indeed, the second howl was a louder one, and the third was like unto it. "Turn out that brute, will you?" said Grandcourt to Lush, without raising his voice or looking at him, as if he counted on attention to the smallest sign. And Lush immediately rose, lifted Fetch, though she was rather heavy, and he was not fond of stooping, and carried her out, disposing of her in some way that took him a couple of minutes before he returned. He then lit a cigar, placed himself at an angle where he could see Grandcourt's face without turning, and presently said, "Shall you ride or drive to Quetcham to-day?" "I am not going to Quetcham." "You did not go yesterday." Grandcourt smoked in silence for half a minute, and then said, "I suppose you sent my card and inquiries?" "I went myself at 4, and said you were sure to be there shortly. They would suppose some accident prevented you from fulfilling the intention, especially if you go to-day." Silence for a couple of minutes. Then Grandcourt said, "What men are invited here with their wives?" Lush drew out a note. "The captain and Mrs. Torrington come next week. Then there are Mr. Hollis and Lady Flora and the Cushats and the Gogoffs." "Rather a ragged lot," remarked Grandcourt after a while. "Why did you ask the Gogoffs? When you write invitations in my name, be good enough to give me a list, instead of bringing down a giantess on me without my knowledge. She spoils the look of the room." "You invited the Gogoffs yourself when you met them in Paris." "What has my meeting in Paris to do with it? I told you to give me a list." Grandcourt, like many others, had two remarkably different voices. Hitherto we have heard him speaking in a superficial interrupted drawl, suggestive chiefly of languor and ennui. But this last speech was uttered in subdued inward yet distinct tones, which Lush had long been used to recognize as the expression of a peremptory will. "Are there any other couples you would like to invite?" "Yes. Think of some decent people, with a daughter or two, and one of your damned musicians, but not a comic fellow. I wonder if Klesmer would consent to come to us when he leaves Quetcham. Nothing but first-class music will go down with Miss Arrowpoint." Lush spoke carelessly, but he was really seizing an opportunity and fixing an observant look on Grandcourt, who now for the first time turned his eyes toward his companion, but slowly and without speaking until he had given 2 long luxuriant puffs, when he said, perhaps in a lower tone than ever, but with a perceptible edge of contempt, "What in the name of nonsense have I to do with Miss Arrowpoint and her music?" "Well, something," said Lush, jocosely. "You need not give yourself much trouble, perhaps, but some forms must be gone through before a man can marry a million." "Very likely. But I am not going to marry a million." "That's a pity, to fling away an opportunity of this sort, and knock down your own plans." "Your plans, I suppose you mean." "You have some debts, you know, and things may turn out inconveniently after all. The heirship is not absolutely certain." Grandcourt did not answer, and Lush went on. "It really is a fine opportunity. The father and mother ask for nothing better, I can see, and the daughter's looks and manners require no allowances, any more than if she hadn't a sixpence. She is not beautiful, but equal to carrying any rank, and she is not likely to refuse such prospects as you can offer her." "Perhaps not." "The father and mother would let you do anything you like with them." "But I should not like to do anything with them." Here it was Lush who made a little pause before speaking again, and then he said in a deep voice of remonstrance, "Good God, Grandcourt, after your experience, will you let a whim interfere with your comfortable settlement in life?" "Spare your oratory. I know what I am going to do." "What?" Lush put down his cigar and thrust his hands into his side pockets as if he had to face something exasperating, but meant to keep his temper. "I am going to marry the other girl." "Have you fallen in love?"
This question carried a strong sneer. "I am going to marry her." "You have made her an offer already, then?" "No." "She is a young lady with a will of her own, I fancy. Extremely well fitted to make a rumpus. She would know what she liked." "She doesn't like you," said Grandcourt, with the ghost of a smile. "Perfectly true," said Lush, adding again, in a markedly sneering tone, "However, if you and she are devoted to each other, that will be enough." Grandcourt took no notice of this speech, but sipped his coffee, rose, and strolled out on the lawn, all the dogs following him. Lush glanced after him a moment, then resumed his cigar and lit it, but smoked slowly, consulting his beard with inspecting eyes and fingers, till he finally stroked it with an air of having arrived at some conclusion, and said in a subdued voice, "Check, old boy." Lush, being a man of some ability, had not known Grandcourt for 15 years without learning what sort of measures were useless with him, though what sort might be useful remained often dubious. In the beginning of his career he held a fellowship, and was near taking orders for the sake of a college living, but not being fond of that prospect, accepted instead the office of traveling companion to a marquess, and afterward to young Grandcourt, who had lost his father early, and who found Lush so convenient that he had allowed him to become prime minister in all his more personal affairs. The habit of 15 years had made Grandcourt more and more in need of Lush's handiness, and Lush more and more in need of the lazy luxury to which his transactions on behalf of Grandcourt made no interruption worth reckoning. I cannot say that the same lengthened habit had intensified Grandcourt's want of respect for his companion, since that want had been absolute from the beginning, but it had confirmed his sense that he might kick Lush if he chose, only he never did choose to kick any animal, because the act of kicking is a compromising attitude, and a gentleman's dog should be kicked for him. He only said things which might have exposed himself to be kicked if his confidant had been a man of independent spirit. But what son of a vicar who has stinted his wife and daughters of calico in order to send his male offspring to Oxford, can keep an independent spirit when he is bent on dining with high discrimination, riding good horses, living generally in the most luxuriant honey-blossomed clover, and all without working? Mr. Lush had passed for a scholar once, and had still a sense of scholarship when he was not trying to remember much of it, but the bachelor's and other arts which soften manners are a time-honored preparation for sinecures, and Lush's present comfortable position was as good a sinecure in not requiring more than the odor of departed learning. He was not unconscious of being held kickable, but he preferred counting that estimate among the peculiarities of Grandcourt's character, which made one of his incalculable moods or judgments as good as another. Since in his own opinion he had never done a bad action, it did not seem necessary to consider whether he should be likely to commit one, if his love of ease required it. Lush's love of ease was well satisfied at present, and if his puddings were rolled toward him in the dust, he took the inside bits and found them relishing. This morning, for example, though he had encountered more annoyance than usual, he went to his private sitting-room and played a good hour on the violoncello. End of chapter 12. This recording is in the public domain.